We're going to talk today about communication and dementia. And I think this is an important topic because I know many of you are caring for loved ones who have dementia, and the communication changes, right? Especially in those earlier stages where maybe things aren't still kind of how they have been, but maybe a few things are kind of slipping through and you're not really sure how to navigate that. But then also in the later stages of dementia as well, sometimes people think, well, they don't talk, they don't communicate, but there's always ways that you can kind of intuit what your loved one wants by looking at some nonverbal ways that we communicate. And so hopefully today I'll bring some clarity. And at the very least, I hope I spark your interest in doing some research on your own, whether that's online, talking with your medical professionals, or even just sitting and observing your loved one in a different way and just seeing what it is that they're trying to say to you without using words. So if you do have questions as we go through, please feel free to enter those into the chat and we can address those at the end. But I do want to reiterate that I am not a medical professional, okay? I am a licensed social worker and I do a lot of research and I do feel like I'm bringing you good, accurate information, but I am not qualified to answer specific case-by-case questions that you may have. So I would just ask that you refrain from giving those to me because I am not your girl. That's not my skill set, okay? So save those for your doctors if you have something specific. So our learning objectives today is we're going to talk about what is dementia, right? We're going to define it very quickly, and different components of communication. How do we communicate with one another? Then we're going to talk about some common changes that occur within a person when they have dementia during the early, middle, and late stages. And then we're going to talk about some ways to best navigate that communication boundary, and ways that we can preserve abilities in a person who has dementia. Okay, so let's go ahead and get right into it. Let me get my screen adjusted because it always goes squirrely on me for some reason. Okay, there we go. So what is dementia? So dementia is an umbrella term, okay? So you can have many different kinds of dementia, okay? So it's not a specific diagnosis, okay? So a person may be diagnosed with dementia of an unspecified type, and that's just where we don't really know the exact form of dementia. And there's over 100 different types or forms and causes of dementia. Now, Alzheimer's disease is the most well-known, okay? And it accounts for about 50 to 75% of all dementia cases. So the likelihood of someone who has dementia having Alzheimer's is high, but it's not guaranteed, okay? So you can have dementia and not have Alzheimer's, but you can't have Alzheimer's and not have dementia, okay? Other types of dementia include vascular dementia, which is usually caused through stroke, Lewy body dementia, which is kind of aligned with Parkinson's disease, frontotemporal dementia, which affects the front temporal area of the brain. And there's also alcohol-induced dementia, okay? So there's many others, but those are the most common ones that we see. So like I said before, Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia. And if someone has Alzheimer's, they have the most common form of dementia. However, it's possible to have dementia without having Alzheimer's, okay? So we don't want to just assume that it's all Alzheimer's because it's not. All right. So continuing on, dementia is not synonymous with memory loss, but a lot of people will conflate the two. So if I were to ask somebody, what do you know about dementia? The most common response is going to be, well, they lose their memory, they forget things, right? They don't remember things like they used to, right? And so, yeah, that is part of dementia for sure, but that is not the entirety of a dementia diagnosis. And those of you caring for a loved one who has dementia, you know this to be true. And that misunderstanding is really how dementia is. It stems from how we portray dementia in the media, in movies, on TV, and things like that. But of course, if you're experiencing it in real life, there's much more, that there's a lot more to the condition than just memory loss. In fact, there are some types of dementia, some forms like Lewy body dementia and frontal temporal dementia that often present without any memory loss, okay, at least initially. So instead, they may lead to challenges with reasoning, the capacity to be rational, right, have rational thought, judgment, and executive functioning. And executive functioning is just your capacity to say, I know the steps it takes to get from A to B, right? So that's executive functioning. And someone who has dementia, they may understand that they want to get from A to B, but they don't understand the steps it takes to get there. Okay, so that's a symptom of dementia. There's about 36 common symptoms, and it's important to understand the underlying causes. Okay, and we're going to go into the brain next a little bit more to just get some more clarity on what's happening inside the brain of your loved one as dementia progresses, okay? So a lot of people will wonder why some individuals develop dementia and some don't, but unfortunately we don't really have a definitive answer, okay? We don't know why people are prone to it or why they get it, okay? Of course, there are certain factors like with vascular dementia, you know, if you're not taking care of your heart, you increase the chances of your brain developing vascular dementia. But really, there's no definitive thing that says if you do this, you will get dementia. Okay, so it's kind of tricky in that way. So let's get into the brain. You guys know I love the brain. And so I like to add it into a lot of my trainings because it's really, once we understand the brain, once we understand the process of dementia, I feel like that's fertile ground to cultivate compassion, right? Because we understand why certain expressions take place or why certain behaviors arise, then it's a lot easier for us as an individual to help manage those expressions and to not take it so personally, okay? So even though this diagram shows brain atrophy in Alzheimer's disease, it is very similar regardless of the kind of dementia that you may have, okay? So let's look at these two pictures. In all forms of dementia, the brain begins to fail, okay? And if we don't have a cognitive impairment, right, if we don't have barriers to how we think, we have a normal brain, like the one we see on the left, right? But when you compare it to the brain on the right, you see there's a lot of spaces there, right? And there's a lot of shrinkage there. Okay, and so we cannot expect the person on the right to act and behave and speak like the person on the left, right? We often have that expectation, right? But they can't, okay? And dementia is a very individualistic disease, right? So the saying is, if you've seen one person with dementia, you've seen one person with dementia, right? So there's a lot of similarities, but everyone's journey is going to be different. So I can give you common things that happen, but I cannot give you a step-by-step guide or a step-by-step guide on your specific experience with dementia, okay? And not every type of dementia is going to manifest in the same way. So you might observe some symptoms and think, oh, well, my loved one isn't doing that. When are they going to start, right? And they may never exhibit that symptom, or they might show it tomorrow, or maybe even in the afternoon, right? Like they, they have that symptom in the morning, and then you never see it again the rest of the day, right? But just because a symptom exists doesn't mean it will necessarily appear in your loved one. But it is essential to be educated about dementia so that you're prepared in case they do start showing certain symptoms, right? Be like, well, why is mom doing this? Oh, that's right, because that's a symptom of dementia, right? So for an example, in one of my support groups, someone mentioned that their loved one has their days and their nights mixed up, right? And that's very common in people who have dementia. And that's because there's that circadian rhythm in our brain that tells us when night and day occur, when sleep and wake, or sleeping and waking happen. And that can become disrupted as the brain atrophies, right? As the brain starts to shrink. And that can lead to people sleeping during the day and being awake at night, right? So their internal clock is backwards. And time does begin to lose meaning for people who have dementia. And so if you're not educated about this, you might think that something else is happening, right? But if you know, then you think, okay, that's just dementia, okay? So today we're going to specifically discuss why communication changes with dementia, okay? So this is not something that your loved one can control. And it may sometimes seem like they're turning the communication off and on, but that's not the case. So if the person was maybe manipulative before the disease, that tendency may still persist because of where those manipulative behaviors are stored in the brain. The right side of the brain typically deteriorates more slowly than the left. So a person who is skilled in manipulation may still exhibit those qualities, even if they're not intentionally turning on or turning off their behavior. Okay. So really, it can get kind of tricky, right? You think, oh, you're doing this on purpose, but they aren't. You're like, well, she was always manipulative in the past and she's just continuing it now. Yes, maybe, but a lot of it could just be the way that her brain now is able to function. So many times, challenging expressions that we observe, that's just your loved one trying to attempt to get a need met, right? And they may not know any other way to communicate that need. And so we're going to have more examples of that as we continue to go on. But I want you to look at these brains and say, so the brain will start off, I think it's weighing 3 pounds. And as the disease progresses, it shrinks down to 1 pound. Okay. So of course, there's going to be a huge gap in functioning between the beginning and the end. So understanding communication and dementia. So let's first consider what communication really is, right? What is it? So it's not just about words or back and forth speaking, and it's not always verbal. So communication involves 2 or more people trying to express a need, a want, a desire, knowledge, or feelings, right? Essentially, we are attempting to meet some kind of need with our communication. And so a person with dementia, as they progress through the disease, they increasingly rely on nonverbal communication, okay? And so as the caregiver or care partner, it's important for you to also use more nonverbal communication, okay? So we have to speak their language. So we're going to discuss something later on called well, I guess we'll go ahead and discuss it now. The theory called retrogenesis. And so this theory suggests that people who have dementia are regressing developmentally. So they're kind of going back in time. But that doesn't mean that we need to start treating them like children, right? But understanding their developmental stage can help guide your communication. So for instance, the way that you would communicate with an 8-year-old is going to differ greatly from how you would talk to a 50-year-old, right? But you can still effectively convey what both need to do, right? So to communicate better, you're going to want to use more body language, right? Facial expressions, tone of voice. And this will be incredibly important, okay? As dementia affects the brain, the hippocampus, which is the area responsible for forming new memories, it becomes damaged, okay? So that's why you can say, well, remember, Mom, I told you yesterday. No, she doesn't, okay? Because the brain that helps remember is not functioning the way it used to, okay? But the amygdala, and that's the part of the brain that's responsible for emotions and the ability to read another person's expressions, that generally will remain intact throughout the progression of the disease, okay? So even if the person with dementia appears to have like a flat affect or kind of like an emotionless expression, they can still perceive tone and facial expressions and body language from you, and they're going to react and respond based on that, okay? And it is worth noting that approximately 80% of the time when your loved one shows a challenging expression or behavior, it's due to how you're approaching the situation or the environment. Okay, so the reaction is usually unintentional, but it often stems from a lack of communication skills, and it can lead them to reacting rather than responding. Okay, so as you communicate with someone who's living with dementia, just be mindful that all the aspects of communication become difficult, increasingly difficult for them over time. So it might feel like you're speaking a foreign language, right? But that doesn't mean that you should use baby talk, right? We don't want to start talking down to somebody just because they are having a hard time understanding what we're saying. But we can simplify our language, right? Shorten our sentences, avoid excessive adjectives and adverbs, okay? So for instance, instead of saying, go sit over there on the gray couch against the wall, right? Try saying, sit here while you pat the chair or indicating the spot, right? So it's gonna be a lot easier for them to understand, sit here, and you showing them rather than you giving a very descriptive sentence, okay? So when we adjust the communication style, we foster a more positive interaction and we help meet their needs a lot more effectively. And of course, the better we can communicate with our loved one, the less stressful it is on us, right? So that's a win-win for everybody. So here's another cross section of the brain, and it illustrates some of the challenges that we face when we can't find the right words, right? So if you're one of those who occasionally struggles with this, don't panic, right? When we speak, we might say, wait a minute, hold on, because the word's just kind of like on the tip of our tongue, right? Um, that doesn't mean you're having dementia or symptoms, okay? When you experience word loss, it's usually attributed to like stress, right? And it's different from dementia, where the person losing words does so repeatedly and may expect you to fill in the gaps for them. So they might say things like the thing or the stuff instead of the specific word that they're trying to find. And that can also lead to something that we call word salad, where they use actual words, but not necessarily in the correct order, right? Or they might switch to different words entirely while still maintaining some inflection, and that can make a conversation possible even without clear language. And so, of course, this is where your skill set as somebody who is intimately connected with the individual can kind of gather what they're trying to say, what they're trying to convey to you. Okay. So you can communicate with someone who isn't using any words all day simply by following their inflection and their preserved abilities. Okay. So let's discuss the differences between the right and the left side of the brain. Okay, so on the left side of the brain, there are functions, language functions, right? And this deteriorates faster for most people who have dementia. So left brain language includes everyday words like boy, girl, computer, car, apple, right? And other proper nouns. But the left side also encompasses the hippocampus, which is responsible for short-term memory, particularly on immediate recall in day-to-day language and functioning, right? So that's the one that where you don't have to think about the words, you just know them, they're second nature and they come out, right? But in contrast, the right side of the brain retains rhythm even as dementia progresses. So many people with dementia, even if they weren't particularly fond of music, they can still connect with it because the rhythm remains intact, right? They can still experience that and it makes sense to them. And so this is really crucial as the disease advances. So for example, if a child under the age of 5 is hurt or upset, we will instinctively pick them up and rock them, maybe pat them, maybe hum a little tune, right? We're introducing that sense of rhythm and comfort, okay? Um, However, sometimes we forget or we stop doing those rhythmic motions when they're most needed, particularly in the later stages of disease. So at this point, maybe all they may need is your rhythmic motion and your presence, okay? So if you have a loved one who's getting agitated, of course, you won't pick them up like a baby and rock them, to calm them down, but you can still utilize their capacity to understand rhythm and their ability to be soothed by rhythm to get them down, okay, to a place that they're more settled. So you can try something called palm to palm contact, right? And just kind of give them that rhythm that can convey safety and companionship. Or maybe you can do like a gentle pat on their feet to provide comfort, and things like that, right? Um, so some of you, when you get stressed out or if you need some kind of soothing or comforting, you might rock in your chair, right? You might tap your legs. These are rhythmic motions that bring comfort. And so while it's normal, right? It's viewed as normal for you. A person with dementia may do something similar without the social filters in place that deem it appropriate, right? So you might be kind of rocking in your chair or tapping your foot, but someone with dementia might be doing a more exaggerated movement or something like that because they don't have that filter anymore. I hope that makes sense. And additionally, so there are certain like forbidden words, right, that tend to be stored on the right side of the brain. So that could be slang, curse words, racial slurs, things like that. And a lot of times people say, well, mom would never say these things, and now she is. This isn't her. Why is she doing these things, right? And it's interesting because it's all about the way the brain stores that information, okay? So those types of words, that forbidden language, it didn't make it into the left side of the brain because that's not part of our everyday language, right? So as children, we weren't scolded or taught not to use things like boy, girl, cat, dog, but we were with, slurs and cuss words, right? And so if you have a loved one who's never used curse words, they may end up using them, right? And people who have never uttered a racial slur might do so under certain circumstances because those forbidden words were stored on the right side of the brain. And so when the left brain's functioning decreases, the right brain, the word bank that's stored there surfaces, okay? So please avoid saying, my loved one would never do that, right? Because you might find yourself in a situation where you realize that, yes, they will, and it's very likely that they will, okay? Because they are going to use what remains, okay? So again, they may be using words that they have to convey a meaning that they don't have words for anymore, okay? So that in and of itself can maybe help you feel a little less offended if they start using these forbidden words directed towards you, right? Of course, sometimes they may be honestly cussing you out, you know, but oftentimes it's just they're using what they have left, okay? And they're not trying to be ugly. That's just where they are in the disease progression, okay? So next, we're going to discuss various aspects of the brain function and memory, particularly in relation to cognitive decline and dementia, okay? So immediate recall, this might be lost, right? While long-term memories can remain intact for a long period. So this concept, again, relates back to that theory of retrogenesis that suggests that as cognitive abilities decline, people may revert to earlier stages of their identity. So for example, someone might see their adult daughter and call her mom, right? Or look at their adult son and think that he's her husband, okay? Because they look the same. And so this occurs because in their minds, they might not recognize that they have adult children, right? They perceive themselves to be younger. So if mom in her mind is 23 and a newlywed, she doesn't know that she's a grandmother or a mother, right? And so if you say, well, no, mom, that's not your husband, that's your son, she's going to look at you like you're out of your mind, right? Because in her mind, that part of her world, that part of her life hasn't happened yet. Okay, so it's important to understand that what others believe is their reality. And while their brains may be failing, this does not mean that they're lying. Okay, you might notice on the screen here, we've got the term confabulation. And that refers to the ability to tell stories. So people with cognitive decline will often tell these stories to fit in and be social, right? So if you're talking with somebody and you're talking about maybe, you know, your degrees that you have, and they start talking about all the degrees that they have, but you know they don't have any degrees, or at least they don't have the ones they're talking about. But they're wanting to communicate, right? They're wanting to be part of the story, part of the conversation happening. And so confabulation is it's kind of a fascinating capacity that we have where we can have bits of information, but there's gaps in that information. And so the brain, because it's wired to make meaning, will then fill in those gaps with stories. Okay, so again, they're not lying necessarily. They may not be telling the truth, but they're telling you their truth and how they experience it. Okay, so again, don't be offended if they start telling you wild stories that don't make any sense. That's just where they are. Okay, that's just where they are. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the brain. And I think this may be my last slide on the brain before we move on. But I think it's important to talk about the amygdala and the hippocampus. Okay, so as a caregiver, as a care partner, it is essential to consider what your body language, your facial expressions, your tone of voice, and your emotions are communicating to another person. Okay. Also, the speed of your movement matters, right? How quickly are you moving through the room? People can read these cues until their last breath, and they can trigger or exacerbate challenging expressions, even if your loved one appears to have no emotion, right? A flat effect. That's because what they feel internally doesn't always manifest on the outside, especially if their brain is failing. Okay, but they can still interpret your signals. Okay, so again, remember the amygdala, that part of your brain is responsible for survival, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. So the forebrain, right, the part that is rational, that can think logically, that can say, well, you know, I'm not in danger or what have you, that is kind of offline, right? Or that's diminished. But the amygdala, the part that says, hey, survive, there's fear, there's danger, that's still very much active. And so think about, what does your body language say when you enter a room? What is your face expressing? What is your tone of voice saying, right? What are your emotions saying? How fast are you moving? They may interpret those signals, cues of danger, frustration, anger, right? And so they're going to respond to that because they're reading your nonverbal communication, okay? Because that's their strength. So that's how they're going to interpret the world. So here's some do's and don'ts for effective communication, okay? Remove distractions if you can. Declutter as much as possible. Of course, if your loved one is present, you don't want to do this while they're still in the room, right? They're like, why are you taking these things from me? I need these things here. You can wait till they go to sleep or go to the bathroom, or if they're eating quietly in another space, what have you, and just quietly remove some items from the room. And the reason why is because clutter can contribute to feelings of depression, affecting everybody, right? Sometimes they'll say if you have a cluttered mind, you're gonna, if you're cluttered internally, you're gonna be cluttered externally. And if you're cluttered externally, you're gonna be cluttered internally, right? Having clutter in the home actually increases your stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, and it's no different for your loved one, okay? Next, make eye contact, right? It's very important. And a genuine smile can really make a big difference when you communicate with someone with dementia. It's essential to project a positive demeanor and use an uplifting tone of voice. Now, I don't like to say, watch your tone, right? As a woman, I've heard that way too many times and it just really rubs me the wrong way. So I'm not trying to tone police anybody, but you just have to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the loved one, right? So if you are not projecting in a positive tone, they're not reading your words necessarily, they're reading that tone. Okay, so if your tone is one of frustration or one of agitation or one of anger, that's what they're going to hear. Okay, they're not going to be able to be like, well, she's just having a stressful day, it's not me. They're going to be like, oh, she's mad at me, or there's something, I have to be mad about as well. Okay. Next, set a positive atmosphere. So try to maintain a positive mood if you can. If you appear downcast or low energy, your loved one is going to mirror that behavior, right? So individuals with dementia, they will follow the emotional lead of whoever's around them, whether it's positive or negative, okay? Be mindful of the environment again. On days when the weather is gloomy or maybe you haven't slept well, you might feel off. And if you're in a bad mood or frustrated, it could lead to the person with dementia to become confused or upset. Okay, they pick up on even the smallest cues from us. And so what connects them with them one day might not connect the next. And eventually, as the brain changes, certain connections might be lost as the brain's functions decline. Okay. And then finally, get on their level, right? It's important to not stand over someone while communicating, right? Try to get down on their level and through their eye level, give them contact and foster that connection, right? If you're standing over somebody and you're huffing and puffing because you're just behind or what have you, and you got your arms folded and you're like, "What are you going to eat?" Right? That's going to elicit a response of defense from them. Okay. So just be mindful of how your body is speaking because it will often speak louder than your words, okay? And so when you're aware of those factors, you can enhance the way that you communicate and the way you interact with your loved one, right? And it just makes it easier for everybody. So we don't want to argue, confront, or remind them that they forgot something important, okay? A significant point to note is that family caregivers will often take things personally, and how could you not, right? But it's crucial for you to not, because the words, someone that maybe mentioned some words to you earlier, maybe they had an angry outburst, maybe they had explicit remarks or racial slurs. That can sometimes include your name in those sentences, right? So it's really hard to not take it personally when they're calling your name out in these conversations, right? And it can be incredibly unkind, but it's important to remember that you can't take it personally because that's dementia speaking, right? It's not your loved one, that's their disease. And dementia can cause people to say and do things that they normally wouldn't, okay? So just keep that reminder in your back pocket on those days where it's really hard to not take it personally. And just try to give yourself some grace and some compassion and some self-care. So nonverbal communication, body language speaks louder than words, okay? So remember, 55% of all communication, whether it's with people who have dementia or not, involves body language, right? And 38% of communication is conveyed through the tone of voice, okay? While only 7% comes from the actual words that we use. So for example, if I'm here giving you this presentation and I'm just kind of flipping through the slides and I'm just reading them in a monotone voice, right? That's not going to engage you very well. But because most of our communication relies on body language and tone, we have to keep that in mind, okay? So 90% of all communication is nonverbal. Okay, so it's not what you say, it's how you say it that's going to be the most impactful to your loved one as their ability to translate your language shifts. So visual cues, gestures, and demonstrations. So when you're caring for someone who has dementia, it's important to demonstrate dignity and independence. Okay, we want to allow them to engage in activities for as long as possible. So instead of saying, do you want to play a puzzle, right? Recognize that no is one of the first words that we learn, and it often remains with your loved one throughout their lives. Okay, so they may say no and mean yes because they've lost yes. Okay. So instead, just try to place the puzzle in front of them and start working on it yourself. Okay. They're going to mirror what you do. Okay. If you're doing it, they're going to think, oh, I need to be doing that too, right? Or I can do that, or this is how I do it, right? If you just say, let's do a puzzle, they might not understand what that even is until you show them. Okay. Another thing that can be effective, a technique you can use, is called a therapeutic story. And I know some people may have a hard time with that idea, thinking that they're lying, but let me give you some reassurance here, okay? So for example, you might say, I'm having a hard time figuring out this puzzle. Can you help me, right? So by making it about you and your need for help, you give them a purpose and a reason to engage, right? It's not just about keeping them busy. It's about involving them in a meaningful way, okay? Now, you might not need help with that puzzle. You might not even want to do the dang thing, right? But you're going to use a therapeutic story and say, I need help with this, right? You can ask, can you help me fold clothes, right? You got a basket of laundry. Can you help me fold these clothes? And you might find yourself going back and refolding those clothes a couple times. But it provides them with a sense of purpose, right? It gives them something to do where they feel that they're being helpful and they're contributing, okay? So tasks like running papers through a shredder can be really enjoyable for people who have dementia because there's a rhythm to it, right? And it gives them a job to focus on. And so, of course, you might have to replace shredders from time to time, but it's important that they feel involved and purposeful. So that's just an example. Another one, we want to avoid telling them, go sit in that chair and watch TV, right? That suggests that they don't matter or they don't have a purpose. And that can be really disheartening for a person who has dementia, right? It's vital to keep them engaged and active. And when you do assist them, demonstrate each step of the activity and act it out one step at a time, okay? So sit directly across from them. If you're eating food and you notice them, kind of looking around like, what am I going to do, right? You just sit in front of them, pick up your utensil and you start eating, and they're probably going to do it with you, right? But it's also good to remind yourself that they might not want to use utensils, right? They may just use their fingers because that's how we learn to eat, right? When you're a little baby, you get finger foods, right? You pick up little things and you stick in your mouth. You're not using forks and spoons and knives and all that, right? At least I hope your baby's not using knives. But so as the retrogenesis takes place, right, as their developmental capacity changes, they might pick up their food with their hands, okay? And that's normal for them to do that. So if you sit directly in front of them, they are likely to mirror your actions for a considerable amount of time. So if they see you using a spoon, they'll likely imitate that behavior because if you're doing it, then they should be doing it too, right? And that mirroring technique can also be helpful if you're trying to get someone to like take a shower, right? So if they've got like maybe like a glass door or they can kind of see you, you can just stand outside and like mimic showering, right? And they're going to do it with you, okay? But if you say something like, get in there and take a shower, you might overlook all the different steps that involves, right? They might get in that shower and they see, I've got all the shampoo and I've got this body wash and these scrubbies and there's a razor and like, what do I even do with these things, right? Dementia impacts your loved one's ability to sequence action, right? That's that executive functioning, right? And so they might not know that to take a shower, it requires getting the water going, taking off their clothes, getting in the shower, putting the soap on their body, rinsing off, right? They've lost that capacity to understand what that means. And so mirroring in that regard can be incredibly helpful for them and for you, okay? And again, it's important to remember that you cannot be entirely reasonable or rational with someone who has dementia, okay? Because their brain processes are deteriorating, okay? It's not their fault, but it is a symptom of the illness. And so our role is to accommodate their needs and help them navigate their condition as they would if they were able, okay? Next, communication tips, okay? When communicating, slow down and smile. Okay, take a deep breath. Okay, when you take a deep breath, you're pushing oxygenated blood to your brain. Okay, and that can make you feel a little bit more uplifted. Smile, because smiling makes your voice sound brighter. And instead of reacting with frustration, just remind yourself that it's not reasonable to expect a rational conversation with someone who isn't being reasonable, right? But we can still communicate with kindness. So one of the best things we can say to someone with dementia is, let's do it together, right? Or I could really use your help, right? And so if they're searching for something and they can't quite find the right words, we can encourage them to describe what they mean. So for example, they might say, you know, that thing that writes, right? Because they can't remember the word pen, but they can remember what it does, okay? So we can ask, what does the thing do? Can you show me the thing, right? When they've lost their words, you can just ask them, what does it do? And then you can help fill in the blanks. It's important to discuss the best communication practices while we interact with people who have dementia. One key point to remember is to avoid using the word remember, right? This can be very detrimental as it serves as a reminder of their forgetfulness, and that can lead them to be very frustrated or even negative reactions. So when you ask someone with dementia if they remember something, you might inadvertently imply that they did something wrong by forgetting, okay? And that can make them feel defensive or trigger negative emotions. So for example, if you say, do you remember yesterday when we fill in the blank, right? They might respond with anger or confusion, stating that they weren't even with you yesterday, right? No matter how loudly or slowly you say it, the past event is just not accessible to them, and arguing about it won't help, right? In fact, if you do manage to quote unquote win an argument with someone who has dementia, it's certainly not worth celebrating, as it's unlikely to happen regularly, right? Engaging in those kind of back and forth arguments, that's just going to elevate the stress levels for both of you involved, right? You're going to start producing cortisol, and then they're going to, they're producing cortisol, and then you're going to be in a bad mood for a long time. They're going to be in a bad mood for a long time, right? The thing is, they might not even remember why they're uncomfortable or in an angry mood, right? But that feeling is still going to linger within their emotional responses, right? It's going to stay because they're going to know I'm angry. They're going to know I'm upset or stressed, but they're not going to know why am I feeling this way, okay? So it's best to communicate with compassion and understanding rather than trying to force recall or win arguments. So a way you can do that is you can just use the word okay, right? That's a good word to use because what it's saying is not that you are agreeing with what they're saying, right? They say, well, you stole all my money, right? And you say, okay, that's not admitting, yes, I did. That's just saying, I heard you, right? I validating what you said. I don't agree with it, but it means that I heard you, right? And so you're not starting an argument. You're just saying, okay. Okay, so once you do that, the next thing you do is you try to fix it. Okay, you can fix it with therapeutic stories. Okay, again, this is not a lie. It's just validating their feelings and avoiding the reaction of the amygdala. Okay, otherwise, you can go back and forth in endless loops for 20 to 40 seconds, and it would feel like you're stuck doing that all day long, right? So if you can tell a therapeutic story, you can validate their feelings, address the issue, and then distract, okay? So a person with dementia can only focus on one thought at a time. They can't really multitask like we can. And so we might be juggling 3 or 4 things at a time, and a person with dementia can only handle one. So does that mean that we must leave immediately? Yes. Because if I just hand them something to do and return to my work in about 20 seconds, they're going to loop back and say, well, you're the one that took all my money, right? And then you just have to start all over again. So validate their feelings, address the situation, and then redirect their attention, okay? So we don't just say, no, mom, that's not true, and leave it at that, okay? We have to distract after we validate. And some good ways that we can distract people who have dementia is these 4 things, okay? Sweet, children, animals, music, okay? So why sweet? Because if you have dementia, every system, every function in your body is going to change. And that includes the way we experience our five senses: taste, touch, sight, smell, hearing, okay? Sweet is one of the last flavor profiles that we lose, okay? So they might not be able to taste anything but sweet. So if you say, well, let's go get some ice cream, right? That's a great distraction because they remember what ice cream tastes like. They can experience that sensation, okay? And that distracts them because remember, they can't multitask like we can. So if you redirect to sweet, then they forgot all about you stealing their money, right? They forgot all about whatever it was that they were frustrated about before because now they get to focus on the sweet, okay? So engaging the senses can really help. So get up, get some ice cream or what have you. Of course, follow your doctor's instructions, but sweet is always a good distraction. And then music, right? We talked before about how we still retain the capacity to translate rhythm. So even if your loved one wasn't a huge music fan, they can still connect with music, right? Research in music therapy shows that the music we listen to between the ages of 10 and 25, like particularly in our teenage years, tends to resonate the most, right? So think about what was your loved one listening to when they were, between 15 and 20, right? Play that music for them. They're going to remember it. They're going to want to be engaged in that for a while, okay? Next, the last two, we've got animals and children. So you might not have access to real animals or children, but you can find videos on YouTube, right? You can find videos anywhere on the internet, really. You just type in, baby animals falling down or babies laughing or something like that, right? Those kind of clips, they're heartwarming. They're a great distraction because they're not, there's no violence or there's nothing, fast or overwhelming in those spaces. It's just kittens playing or babies laughing, right? And that's a great distraction because it's stimulating in a soothing way, in a heartwarming, wholesome way, not in a way that's going to exacerbate that agitation, okay? So remember, validate their feelings, create a comforting story, distract with food, music, animals, or children, okay? I went to a conference and they had, this lady had suggested something called Zinnia TV, and it has videos like that of like people blowing bubbles or touring, the Eiffel Tower or something like that, and just very soothing, low impact imagery. And so that was a good resource that I wanted to share with you all. All right, I'm running out of time, so I might skip through these next ones pretty quickly. So here's an example of a therapeutic story, or what we call validation therapy, okay? So imagine that you're getting dressed for work. You've worked in the same office for 35 years, and today is just like any other day. But maybe you're having trouble tying your tie. So that makes you think, well, maybe my wife is home. She's really good at fixing my tie. So you call out her name. She comes into the room and asks where you're going. You tell her, I've got 10 minutes to leave or I'll be late for work. And she tells you, honey, you've been retired for 10 years and you don't have a job, but you do have dementia. Okay. So how could this have been handled using validation therapy? You just say, okay, I just made your favorite breakfast. How about we eat first? Then I'll drive you to work. Let me get you some coffee. I'll get you there on time. Okay. So that validates and restores their dignity. And you know that once they sit down and they start eating pancakes, they're going to forget all about going to the office because now they're indulging in that sweet, right? But if you sit there and say, well, no, you have dementia, you haven't worked in 10 years, that's going to trigger his amygdala and he's going to start wondering what's going on and feel uncertain. Okay, so that's just an example. So we're going to get into some of these changes in the different stages. Okay, so common changes in the early to mild stages of dementia. So early in the disease, it's essential to focus on what we can do to maintain a sense of normalcy, right? We refer to this as the normalization stage. We want to keep things as stable as possible. But remember that a person in the earliest stages can almost always still read and comprehend, right? However, there will come a time when they can read words without understanding their meanings. But in the beginning, they can still manage both. So encourage them to help with tasks like putting away groceries, doing laundry, unloading the dishwasher, things like that. You might need to use reminders, right? Like maybe using sticky notes on the drawers to say, hey, this is where the plates go, or this is where the spoons go. And that's perfectly fine, okay? That just will help your loved one to stay involved and feel useful, okay? But during this stage, they may experience a lot of agitation and frustration, which is understandable because they're probably aware that something's wrong, right? And it can be really challenging for families because they might sense these changes even if they aren't openly discussing it, right? Maybe your loved one is in denial, and that's leading to frustration that could be directed towards you, right? And so as the primary caregiver, you might find yourselves in that dual role of being both the good guy and the bad guy, right? You might say things like, they might say things like, don't get out of my sight, I need you, or express distrust thinking you're trying to poison me, right? Or you might hear, I've already taken a bath this week, when in reality it's been 3 weeks since their last one. Okay, so that can be very frustrating. And many caregivers will express that during the middle stages of the disease, it might become a little bit easier for them because their loved one is no longer aware of the cognitive decline. Okay, so there's not this gridlock back and forth as much. They don't realize that they're losing certain abilities, and that can alleviate some of that frustration. Okay. Hygiene can decline during the early stages due to difficulties sequencing tasks, like we spoke about earlier, right? They might still be able to brush their teeth and brush their hair. If you just give them the toothbrush with the toothpaste on it, their muscle memory is going to take over, right? But if you just send them to the bathroom with, a bunch of hairspray, shaving cream, razors, toothbrush, and makeup, right? That's going to be overwhelming, okay? So we simplify it, okay? We don't say, well, they can't do it anymore. We just communicate in more simple terms so that they can, okay? So we have to accommodate the disease and adjust the way that we communicate, okay? Let's see, other changes that are common include an increased reliance on visual gestures, even in the initial stages, okay? So we want to use visual cues and be mindful of body language in this time. It's common for a person with dementia to experience mood swings that can fluctuate significantly, right? Sometimes it can change from 1 minute to the next, or even day to day or week to week, okay? If you're involved in caregiving for a while, you might have noticed sometimes that when you leave the room and return, they may react differently and you find yourself wondering what happened, right? They were fine when I left and I walked in and they're really agitated, right? You don't know what happened. You may never know what happened, right? Maybe they heard something that startled them, or maybe they didn't realize you walked into the kitchen and they looked, oh, where is she? When's the last time I saw her? Is she coming back, right? We don't know. But it can occur frequently, and that can contribute to some of their mood swings, okay? All right, let's go ahead and see. So communication tips in the early stages, focus on normalization, right? Arguing or insisting will never help. Nobody likes being told what to do, okay? Sometimes you can, if you're trying to get your loved one to do something that has been advised by their doctor and they don't want to hear you say it, maybe see if the doctor can talk to them, right? Or maybe the pharmacist, and say, this is doctor's orders, you have to do it, right? That kind of thing. And so if you can appeal to someone in authority, that might make things easier for you, okay? Identify yourself or other people if they're having a hard time remembering names. You can say like, oh, this is, you remember Jane, right? That kind of thing. So that way, they might not remember Jane's name, but they remember her face, but then you avoid them being embarrassed that they don't remember Jane's name, okay? Because you've already provided that information right away, okay? But again, support, honesty, normalization, friendships, being nurturing, right? Those are very, very important. We don't want to pull away. We just want to learn how to do things differently. So mid to moderate stages, okay? So this is going to be typically the longest stage of the disease. It can last between 2 and 10 years. And so this is the longest stage of decline, and you're going to see a lot of changes in the way that they speak and communicate, okay? They're going to gradually lose their ability to communicate normally. And so, of course, we've got images of the brain and notice that certain areas associated with language are beginning to atrophy or shrink or break down. And that's going to indicate a decline in functioning, okay? Many people lose their track of time entirely. So, for example, if you say, it's 3 a.m., why are you up, right? They might not resonate with them. That might not resonate with them in the same way. So if you think about like when a 2-year-old wakes up at that hour, you wouldn't say it's 3 a.m. You would say something like, oh, it's dark outside, it's time to go back to sleep, right? So we teach children that dark means sleep and light means awake, but sometimes it can just be helpful to step outside and notice that it's still dark. And so you can say, oh my goodness, it's still dark outside, let's go back to bed for a little while, right? Even if they put on their clothes, even if they put on their shoes, right? What have you, it's still okay for them to just lay down and get some sleep. So choose your battles and choose them wisely, okay? They can sleep in their boots as long as they're back in bed and you know where they are, okay? And you can go back to sleep. So it is important to remember that although we're not treating them like 2-year-olds, if their cognitive development is comparable to that of a 2, 3, or 5-year-old child, we should use appropriate language. Okay, so you wouldn't show a 2-year-old a clock and say it's 3. You would just simply open the blinds and say it's dark and leave it at that. Okay. So in the middle stage, your approach is going to largely be supportive as they require help with the majority of tasks, right? And that often can include a lot of apologizing. So for example, I might say, I'm so sorry, I forgot to tell you about that appointment. Even though you mentioned it several times, wrote it down, called them, texted them on your way over, what have you. And they're gonna, when you arrive, they're gonna look at you and be like, what are you doing here? So it's essential in those moments to just validate their feelings. Like, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you, right? So instead of fighting over the appointment and say like, well, mom, I told you 12 times we're going to the doctor. We've had this appointment for 6 months, right? Just emphasize the positive, right? Then you say, oh, well, it's right next to Sonic, and I know you love their chocolate milkshakes. So you're validating, and it's also a moment of distraction and make the outing enjoyable. Okay. So you can say, we're going to the doctor. Let's get your jacket on. Come on, it's ready to go, right? We're ready to go. Validate that positive redirection and making it a pleasant experience for them instead of saying, oh, you forgot again. I told you this and you don't remember, right? So you see the difference? It's really just about how are you responding. Yes, you know they forgot. They don't know they forgot. And you're reminding them that they forgot is going to encourage some of those challenging behaviors, okay? Let's see. So common changes that we observe in individuals with dementia affect impulse control. So that means that their ability to filter thoughts and actions is managed by the frontal lobe of the brain. That's going to diminish over time. And that filter is what guides us to think before we speak or before we act and help us to decide when to refrain from saying or doing something and when it's appropriate to engage. Okay. So, for example, if we are hanging out and it starts to feel warm, right? Most of us would just, maybe take off a cardigan or change the thermostat, right? However, a person with dementia may respond differently. So if they're feeling too hot, or maybe they've got a tag scratching their back or whatever, they might just impulsively rip the tag out or take their clothes off, right? This isn't misconduct. It's just an instinctual response to discomfort. Okay, so they're just trying to meet a need in the best way that they know how. So just like a 3-year-old might not understand the concept of adjusting a thermostat, individuals with dementia might not comprehend appropriate social boundaries, leading them to act on their immediate needs instead. Okay, now I have children, and this has happened to me before. Mom, these pants are uncomfortable, and then off they come, whether we're in the middle of the grocery store or at a park or whatever, right? This is not something I like. I'm getting rid of it. Okay. And I don't scold my child for that because they're learning. Okay. And I understand. And so a person with dementia, you can kind of take that same approach, right? You understand why they're doing that. They're not trying to be difficult, okay? They're just uncomfortable, and so they're trying to make themselves comfortable. So now we're going to switch very quickly into the late stages of dementia. Okay, so this is one of the most difficult stages for those with the disease, with their family members, caregivers, and professionals alike. Okay, they are totally reliant on you for all their activities of daily living. And so this is what we consider the sensory stage. Okay, so communication is kind of broken down to where it's just really all sensory. Okay, so they can still communicate in some way up until the last breath. Okay, so for example, they may communicate feeling pain non-verbally by furrowing their brows or clenching their fists, right, curling their toes. The body is still capable of conveying their needs, even if their mouths are not. Okay. In these later stages, it's not uncommon for your loved one to sleep up to 20 hours a day, right? But you can still find joy and relationship in those few hours that they are awake, okay? It's important to recognize each stage of the disease and not focus solely on what was lost, but concentrate on what remains, right? If we think about only what we've lost, you risk falling into depression, okay? But you can appreciate what remains and still recognize the losses, okay? And that's why support groups, having a social network, maybe even having a spiritual group or something like that, someone that you can talk to, because it is not going to be easy in this space, okay? But it's possible to navigate it. All right. So really quickly, dementia can be treated. Okay. It's important to acknowledge that we need to continue learning and building a skill set, even if it's one we never wanted, right? But it is essential. So learning to tell therapeutic stories can be challenging, but the more you practice, the easier it becomes. And you might actually surprise yourself with how creative you can be. But commitment, flexibility, and compassion are crucial in this process, okay? And I want to leave you with this last thought before we go. A person with dementia is never giving you a hard time. They are having a hard time, okay? They are not giving you a hard time. They're having a hard time. And I hope that blooms compassion in you as you move forward. So thank you for your time. I will have this presentation listed on the website soon, but if you were interested in the slides, because there was a lot of information on the slides, please let me know, and I have no problem sharing those with you so that you can go through them as you need. And I'll go ahead and stop my share now. Oh, I hit the wrong button. And mic recording.